Hi everyone. In today's video I thought I would go over my plan for supporting my tomato plants. You may see I've got some tomato cages back here, and you might be thinking to yourself, everyone knows those don't work, right? It's true. A lot of the times they don't. And so let me just back up and tell you about my history as a gardener. I first started gardening about 22 years ago when I lived in a small apartment with a small outdoor patio, and my yellow jacket friend is back. So since I only had a patio, my only option for gardening was gardening in containers. I grew tomatoes, I grew peppers, I grew flowers, herbs, all kinds of things. I used to actually have this little wind-up hose that would attach to my kitchen faucet in the apartment, and I could stretch it all the way out through my living room into the patio where I could water because there was no outdoor faucet and there was no way I wanted to haul watering can after watering can inside and outside. So that was how I made do. And it was fun. I really enjoyed it. That's where I developed my love of gardening. A few years after that, I moved to a little condo, it didn't have any in-ground gardening space, but it did have a really large back deck that faced south, and it had tons of light. It was perfect for gardening, but again, I had to do everything in containers. But that was fine. It was a step up. I had more space. I had a faucet outdoors. I didn't have to drag. Eventually, I managed to hook up a drip system on a timer to that, so it was awesome, and I loved it. But when you're a container gardener, as far as trellising tomatoes, you're kind of limited to just these cages. For the first 15 years that I was gardening and growing vegetables, I was using these. A few years later after that, in 2016, I moved to my first real house with a real backyard in the suburbs, of course. My husband built a set of really nice raised beds for me, and I was so excited to plant that first spring. Because tomato cages were all I knew up until then. This is what I stuck with. And that first spring or first summer, I found that they didn't work so well. They didn't work great when I was in containers, and they don't work great in raised beds either. Especially I lived in a pretty windy climate. And I also lived in California, where the growing season is really, really long, more than 200 days. I could plant tomatoes in March and have them, there were times where I would be harvesting into December. And when you have indeterminate tomatoes, they keep growing as tall as they can grow. Then they would start to drape over, they would start to lean into the walkways. It was a pain. I tried lots of things. I tried sturdier cages, I tried taller cages, I tried square cages. It didn't really make a difference. They all eventually started to fall over. So after about maybe a year or so of gardening in my new backyard with my new raised beds, I noticed that YouTube had lots of gardening channels. I learned new tricks that I'd never heard of before. I saw for tomato trellising specifically, there were all different methods. One method that I saw was from M.I. Gardener, where he would put these really tall, I think they were like 8-foot tall furring strips, they're called. They're like 1 by 2 inch wooden stakes. Are pretty cheap. At least when I got them, they're only like $1 something a piece. And then the idea was you would prune your tomatoes to a single stem, and you would attach it with elastic along the way, all the way up the furring strip. I tried that one year, and my tomatoes very quickly grew to the top of those 8-foot furring strips. And they started to lean. And then another thing that was really frustrating, the weight of the tomato plant, especially once it had tomatoes on it, it began to kind of slide down the pole. And on a few of my tomatoes, I had like the stem near the bottom was just warped and cutting off circulation. Basically, I had at least one plant die because of that. It just wasn't working for me. Another method I saw, which I really wanted to try, was where you put T-posts in your raised bed, and then you put a cattle panel up on the T-posts, which gives your tomatoes something you can attach to better than just a single pole they can slide down. It has like a grid where you can attach your tomatoes as they grow. And again, this is best for single stem pruning. Backing up to single stem pruning, I lived in such a dry climate that wasn't really necessary for me. And what I found when I did single stem prune was the tomatoes that I got were really exposed to the harsh sunlight, and some of them got sunburn spots on the skin. Because there weren't enough leaves surrounding them to kind of keep them shaded. So I wasn't crazy about that. And then yield in general, I didn't get nearly as many tomatoes when I pruned to a single stem as I did when I would just let my plants go within their cages, which would then fall over. So there were a lot of things about that I didn't like. You know, I didn't do this in my old house because, like I said, I was in the suburbs. We didn't have a truck at the time, so there was no way for us to haul 8-foot cattle panels from the feed store to our house. When the single stake furring strips didn't work, I tried a hybrid approach. I tried putting a cage down for the tomato, then the stake down the middle, the 8-foot wooden stake, and I would attach the tomato without pruning it, but I would attach the main stem to that central stake. And my hope was that that extra support would keep it from tipping over, but it didn't. I think I did that one year, and then the following year I did the same thing, except I doubled up the cage. I put one cage in like this, furring strip down the middle, and then another cage upside down right on top, which I'll show you in a second what that looks like. But again, the furring strip wasn't enough to hold it up. So when we moved here, I was pretty excited about the option of using cattle panels in my garden, not just for trellising tomatoes, but I can also do the 16-foot arched trellis, which I've always wanted to do. I will be doing that at some point soon. But you know, this garden season kind of snuck up on me, and here I am. I've got tomatoes in the ground. I don't have any cattle panels yet. Time didn't allow for it. So this time I'm trying something different. I'm giving these cages one last season to see if I can make them work with yet another hybrid approach. So for my plan for this year, I've already got the single cages installed in the beds around each tomato. I put them on purpose really close to these arches for each one because I'm going to attach them in the hopes of this extra support of the whole structure, helping my cages not to tip over. For the additional height of the tomatoes, I am going to do the double stacking method like this. And basically you just zip tie the two rings together and it stays upright, and your tomato can grow much taller with some support without having to prune to a single stem. So let me show you how I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna start with this one. Just gonna rest it on there. I've got these teeny tiny zip ties. So, all right, so I've got this is how they're gonna stay together. Now I'm gonna get a bigger zip tie. I'm gonna loop around behind the white support. I need to come up with a better name, arch support, PVC arch support. I don't even know what to call these things. All right, so there's that. Let's do the next one. All right, next. One of the trickier parts is actually stacking these without them falling over before you can zip tie them. I need 3 arms for this. And I've actually done a similar method for my peppers. Peppers aren't nearly as heavy. They don't grow as tall as tomatoes either, but some of them do grow pretty tall. And so I would take the smaller tomato cages, the really skimpy ones you find, they're like $1 each or something, and I would double stack those. But I also put my peppers fairly close together, so the cages would end up butting up against each other, and I could zip tie them together, and then I had this whole structure of support that stayed upright and was tall enough for the taller pepper plants like poblanos. The downside though is at the end of the season you have to go through, cut all these zip ties, collect them, throw them away, and get your dead plants out of there, and it's a little bit harder for cleanup at the end of the season. All right, so I've got these. I need one more big zip tie to go around the PVC arch support. And do that pretty tight. All right, so you'll see that this structure does wiggle on its own a little. So I have a plan for that. I'm going to get a couple of like 6-foot T-posts, and I'm gonna, let's see, hopefully you can see, I'm gonna put one T-post down here, as deep as I can get it, and attach the T-post to the arch structure. And I'm gonna do that on both ends of the structure. So my hope is that the whole thing will be sturdy enough with all these cages attached to it and the T-post at the end that nothing's gonna fall over. We'll see. This is my experiment. If this fails this year, I'm going to the trellis method. While we're out here, I thought I'd give you a little update on what I did yesterday. I added mulch to the remainder of my planted beds. So that's the tomatoes and the other tomatoes. Broccoli I did on another video. And then I also finally added mulch to the other half of my garlic onion bed. I also added straw to all of my potato grow bags to keep the water in and the sunlight out. And then in these beds, I haven't actually planted these yet, but there are some volunteer potatoes. I decided to just let them go. And I'm going to add, I think, my tomatillo plants to the back of these beds. And I'm going to do this weekend's plan is to get the rest of the junk out of this bed and add a lot more soil because it's pretty low in this bed. So it'll be beans here and then squash here. And then in this last bed, which is a mess, I'm gonna get all this junk out of here, move the tomatoes. These are my extra tomatoes. Haven't decided what to do about them yet. Get the peppers, get everything out of the way, refresh the soil with another layer from the pile. And then I'm gonna get my peppers planted in this bed and fairly close together. And like I said, I'm gonna do the double cage method with those two, I think. Because they do need at least some support, especially the poblanos just fall all over the place. They get really tall and giggly, and then the peppers are heavy, and so they just kind of fall over. So, but we've been in the middle of a heat wave, and our forecast, it's been really warm during the day, and it's not cooling off a whole lot at night. But I noticed in the next few days, we're gonna have some temperatures down to around 45 degrees at night, and pepper plants don't like to be below 50 degrees. They can be stunted. So what I'm gonna do is go ahead and plant these anyway. And I ordered some greenhouse plastic sheeting that I'm gonna cover this bed with to get through those few cold nights. It'll be a lot like the broccoli bed, but with plastic instead of bug netting. And so that should do the trick, and then I won't have to worry about them being stunted from the cold weather overnight. Guys, look what I just found on the back of my property, left by the previous owners. Tomato cages. I don't know if they're the right size, but they should be good for my peppers if nothing else. Well, that's it for today. I am off to Lowe's to get more of these cages to put on top of all 16 of my tomato plants, and then the feed store to get some teed posts for the ends of the structures. Catch you next time.